Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to click over to the slides here so everybody can see them. And I trust that if for some reason they're not visible, uh, someone will, Xavier or somebody else on the line will alert me to that. We've gone through several practice runs this morning to make sure that the technology is working correctly for me to communicate with you here from Tennessee. And let me wish you all good evening. We're in the middle of a rainy morning and midday here in the south eastern United States, and I know your day is ending over in Europe, and this is a good time to have a short discussion about weed management and how we go about managing weeds in turf grass systems. And that's certainly an area that I'm very interested in here in Tennessee, and I do a lot of work in nationwide across the United States and some on an international level as well. And I hope that you can take a few things from this presentation today to improve your weed management programs in the future. So the title of today's presentation is Indicator Weeds. What is your turf telling you? And I think that that is an important place to start, uh, given that when we have weed issues in a turf situation, it really is a flag of some other problem with our growing environment. And especially in parts of the world where herbicide technology may be limited, knowing that and knowing how the growing environment will affect weeds is an important tool for integrated management moving forward. So let's begin there with a key question. And that key question is the basic definition. What is a weed? How do we define what a weed is in a turf grass system? And several individuals have offered definitions dating back to as far as 1876 from Emerson, who said that a weed is any plant whose virtues have not been discovered. Blatchley in 1912 defined a weed as a plant that's out of place or growing where it is not desired. I think that is probably the definition that most of us are familiar with when we think of, well, what is a weed? The most common thing that I hear when I ask that question is it's a plant out of place. But honestly, I think the best definition may be from Aldrich in 1984. And Aldrich stated, a weed is a plant that originated in a natural environment and in response to or imposed, excuse me, and in response to imposed or natural environments, evolved and continues to do so as an interfering associate with our crops and activities. And you'll notice that the word environment is bolded twice on this slide. And I think that that is really important, and a take-home message for anybody managing turf is that the weeds we see in our turf are a function of the growing environment. They are a signal that something in the growing environment is askew, which is causing conditions to be favorable for that weed to become present in the turf, and our turf stand to be less competitive. And you can really sum that up simply by saying that this definition, this knowledge that weeds are a function of our growing environment, it tells us that our weeds are not accidental. They are not an accidental plant within our golf course fairway or our lawn, that they're there for a reason, and that reason is the growing environment. And that is important because it tells us that more than just herbicide will be required for sustainable weed management. That if we don't do something to correct the growing environment, we're going to continue to have weeds. Here I have stand of Bermuda grass, Cytinodactylon. I believe this is a hybrid Bermuda grass, Cytinodactylon crossed with Transvalensis. And we can see that it is shaded. We can also see tire tracks in this photo. We can see golf carts in the background. This is an area of turf where we have Bermuda grass and shade, where it will automatically be weakened from that environmental stress. In addition, the layout of this facility is such that golf cart traffic is now covering this turf and adding an additional stress, non-environmental, but a stress nonetheless, to this turf stand, and the overall turf is weakened. And we're going to have weeds come into this turf stand because the environment is such that the turf is not growing optimally, and there's an opportunity for weeds to invade. And trying to change the growing environment is the real basis for integrated weed management and sustainable management of weeds in an integrated fashion over time. And if we take the most beautiful turfgrass stand, this is a stand of Paspalum vaginatum, seashore paspalum in Hawaii. We look at this and think this is the most beautiful stand of turfgrass possible. But underneath the surface, there are hundreds of thousands of weed seeds. We have reports with different species. This is one that was published in 2004 with Poa annua, that we have 80% of viable annual bluegrass seed in a turf situation is in the top 1 centimeter of soil. And we know from other research that we can have hundreds of thousands of viable annual bluegrass seed in a very small area of turfgrass. Underneath that canopy, there is really a dearth of weeds waiting for an opportunity to invade turf. So we look at this stand that looks beautiful, and any sort of loss of cover in this stand is going to provide an opportunity for that weed seed that is beneath the surface to germinate, grow, and become established in turf. In knowing that our weed seed is there, that it is beneath the surface in a great abundance, is important, and we have to keep that in mind right from the beginning. Even when we're establishing turfgrass, we have to factor in that the soils we will be working in most likely are going to have hundreds of thousands of weed seeds in them. If we take a stand of turfgrass here, I've made kind of a diagram. We can see the green line across the screen. This will represent our turf canopy or our vegetation. And then the brown rectangle is our soil. And then the light brown ovals are our weed seed. Well, when we renovate an area to establish new turf, what do? We will remove the existing vegetation, so the green will go away. And now we have exposed that existing weed seed to all of the factors that it will need to germinate and grow. We've exposed that weed seed to sunlight because we've now removed the turf canopy or the plant canopy that was there. In the process of establishing new turf, we're inevitably going to apply some sort of nutrition via fertilizer, and that nutrition would not only help new turfgrass seedlings grow, it's going to help the weed seedlings that are in your soil grow as well. When we irrigate turf regularly to facilitate new seed germination and new growth of our newly established turfgrass stand. And that process of irrigating is also going to favor weed seed in terms of irrigation as well. And I think that this is important on any level of renovation, that we consider these sorts of factors, be it a renovation of any type of turfgrass area. we know that everything that we do during renovation can affect weed seed growth. And if we want to try to minimize problems related to weeds after establishment, we need to keep that in mind from the beginning. Whether it's a greens renovation, whether on a golf course fairway, it's a regrassing project where we're going to take the existing grass that's on a fairway and renovate to a new grass, we need to make sure that we're taking the time to renovate correctly. And the natural question would be, well, what are the steps to do that? The first step would be to fumigate, if that's possible. Here in the United States, our most widely used soil fumigant was methyl bromide. We no longer have the ability to use that product. There are soil sterilants available. Dazomet is one active ingredient that I know is used globally for soil sterilization during establishment. But this is not always possible in every scenario. Budget constraints can limit the ability of using this technology during a renovation. The ability to find and access the product can limit the use of fumigants or sterilants during an establishment. And then the overall square footage being renovated is another factor that can affect whether this is a practical step to take in renovation. Small square footage areas, if you're renovating a tee, for example, use of a soil sterilant may be something that's advisable. If you're going to be renovating 18 golf course fairways on very large hectareage, that is something where a soil sterilant probably is not going to be a logical tool for use. In those cases, non-selective herbicide is certainly a step in order to try to remove as many weeds that are present in the site as possible before we come in with an investment of new grass and an establishment project. And there's a case to be made for physical removal of certain weed species in order to, particularly perennials, in order to make sure that they're less problematic in our new stands. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So here you have a photo of Seashore Paspalum vaginatum on a golf course. This is in Florida in the southern United States. And what they have done here is they have physically removed via a sod cutter Bermuda grass contamination, Cydanon dactylon infestation in this Paspalum fairway. And the reason for doing so was that during the renovation, they felt if they could physically remove the Bermuda grass, that would set them up to be more successful in the long term, because there are so few options to manage Bermuda grass chemically after establishment. So if we're going to close a fairway and renovate, let's take the extra steps needed to try to minimize this problematic weed that we know will cause many, many struggles down the road once the establishment is complete and the fairway reopens. Another practice that's used, particularly in climates where we have conditions or weather for weed growth over a large span of the calendar year, is to turn soil prior to establishing new grass. Prior to coming to the University of Tennessee, I was a faculty member at the University of Hawaii, and what you see on the screen here is a photo of some research plots that I had established. And this was before we planted new turf grass. And what I learned in the process of doing this is that turning soil prior to establishment can be helpful. In the scenario here, what we did was we removed the existing turf, we exposed the soil, and then we let all the weed seed that was in the top layer of that soil germinate and grow. And this was particularly useful because we could then come back in with another application of non-selective herbicide, particularly glyphosate, and control those weeds, turn the soil again, and then let that cycle of germinating weed seed come up, and then control those with another non-selective application. We were basically depleting the soil seed bank prior to coming in and establishing new turf. This is also particularly useful when trying to control sedge species. Here, at this one particular site on the screen, we dealt a lot with purple nutsedge, Cypress rotundus, which is a very problematic sedge species in turf in warm and tropical climates. It grows from nutlets, as you can see in the photo on the left, and those nutlets are connected by rhizomes. It is very difficult to deplete these nutlets or tubers via a herbicide application, making many of the tools available ineffective for chemical management. And in any event, we probably need 2 or 3 herbicide applications over time to reduce a population. Turning that soil, though, helps us to manage those tubers and manage tuber dormancy. There's been a vast amount of research done on this. We know that those nutsedge tubers will be viable for 3 years or more when they're in a soil with moisture. But if we can dry those tubers out, we can reduce the viability down to a number of days, to say 7 days or less. And this is what we were doing in the plots you saw prior. Turning the soil over would expose buried nutsedge tubers to sunlight. That soil would dry out in the sun, and it would basically reduce the viability of those tubers over time, which set us up to be very successful after establishing new grass, that we had lowered the likelihood of having nutsedge problems in our new stand of turf. So when we think about renovation with trying to manage weeds and reduce weed infestation after establishment, again, the steps are fumigation, potential use of a soil sterilant, non-selective herbicide, potentially physically removing particularly problematic perennial weeds such as Bermuda grass, or this process of turning soil that I showed you several slides ago in regards to sedge management. And I would advise anybody to try to combine these techniques if it's possible, and to do them repeatedly, to go through this process maybe 1 or 2 times, knowing that after we're done with an establishment, the last thing anyone wants is to have weeds in their new turf. And if we can put the time in on the front end to try to go through these clean renovation techniques, we can minimize the likelihood of weeds being a problem on the back end. And the other thing to keep in mind is that renovation is an option for addressing other issues, particularly agronomic issues that may limit the competitiveness of your newly established turfgrass stand. Time to potentially correct a root zone issue. We can see here, this is a Poa pratensis stand established on a sand-based root zone. We have several layers that are present within this stand. These are going to be problematic for turf growth over time. We know that the root zone will really be the foundation of any successful establishment, and we want to do what we can in order to make sure we have a good foundation. We also want to select the right grass. This is going to be another key step in trying to minimize weed infestation into new turfgrass stands. I took the photo on the screen here. This is a picture from Knoxville, Tennessee, to highlight poor grass selection. This is a newly sodded area of Cynodactylon, Bermuda grass, and we can see very heavy tree shade here. And what we know about Bermuda grass is very clear. It does not do well in shaded conditions. And naturally, what will happen, even under the most ideal management, this grass is going to lose density, it's going to lose vigor, and be less competitive. And therefore, we're going to provide an opportunity for weeds to become established and invade this area. I would also encourage anybody who's renovating an area, particularly on a golf course, to visit the site where they will be getting their new plant material, particularly if it's sprigs or sod, and look at the material coming into the golf course, for example, and see, are there weeds present in that? Because you certainly don't want to introduce weeds to your site that may not be there already. You can really learn a lot about the quality and sanitation of plant material by visiting your sod farm or your sprig producer before that plant material makes its way to your golf course. And you don't, because you don't want to introduce new weeds to your site. And I know that this can be a difficult conversation for some to have. I would also tell you that I would not be afraid to reject material that is delivered to your site if it does not meet your level of quality. If you are paying particularly for sod, say you're installing seashore paspalum or a Bermuda grass or a zoysia grass, and that sod comes in with weeds present, it is well within your right as a paying customer to reject those loads and try to get something that is going to be more acceptable to you, because you don't want to introduce weeds into your facility. Now, we've talked a lot about ways to manipulate the growing environment during establishment to minimize weed infestation. But what do we do with an established stand of turf? When we already have turf in place and we have weeds present, how does the environment come into play? And that is really where this concept of indicator weeds becomes so important. We know that we have a number of different species that are indicators of different agronomic problems. On the screen here, you'll see cypress species, which is our sedges, Diodia virginiana, which is a broadleaf species that's very common in the transition zone in southern United States. I'm not sure if it is present in mass in Spain or in Western Europe, but likely so. Kalinga species are certainly problematic in turf, and I believe everybody listening now is certainly familiar with Poa annua. It's probably our most well-known weed of turfgrass systems. And these are 4 examples of weeds that we know are indicative of excessive soil moisture. This could be a situation where we're over irrigating turf, where we're running irrigation systems for longer than we should be. This could be an indicator that maybe we have a drainage issue at our golf course and our soils are maintaining moisture at a higher percentage than they should be for a longer duration than they should be. They're an indicator of excessive soil moisture. So if you see sedge or kalinga species in turf, rushes or juncus species is the genus, Diodia virginiana, Poa annua, cardamine species, these are bittercress here in the US, hydrocotyl species, moss, and there's several other broadleaf weeds that fit this distinction. If you see these in your turf grass, it should be a flag to you that maybe there's a soil moisture issue at play, that the site where this is in, moisture in soil is a little bit more than it should be, and we need to do something about that, whether it is an adjustment to how we are irrigating turf or maybe an adjustment to how we are draining turf. But you should keep in mind that knowing that these weeds are indicators of excessive soil moisture doesn't mean that you cannot find them in a dry soil. I think Poe is a really good example of that. We can see annual bluegrass in many different places, dry soil, wet soil, what have you. Um, but in most instances, several of the weeds on this indicator list for soil moisture really tend to favor these wet soils. Another thing to keep in mind is that just correcting soil moisture isn't going to lead to removal. If you are managing a turf grass stand that has a heavy infestation of Diodia virginiana or any cypress species, simply adjusting irrigation or improving drainage is not going to remove those plants from your turf. What it will do is it will make them less likely to come back and invade your turf after they have been removed. And that's what we're going for when we talk about integrated weed management and sustainable weed management, that we would have some sort of remediation to remove those plants from our turf, but then we change the growing environment to make reinfestation less likely. It could also be a tool for identifying a potential problem. The photo on the screen here I captured in Thailand. This is a Kalinga species in a zoysia grass stand on a driving range in Thailand. And we can see the Kalinga really heavily populated around the irrigation head. And that is not coincidental, as we talked about in the introduction, because what myself and the golf course superintendent identified was that this irrigation head was leaking, and the soil around the irrigation head had elevated soil moisture, obviously, and therefore we had this mass of Kalinga around the irrigation head that wasn't present on other areas of the driving range. And this is a really classic example of an indicator weed identifying a potential problem. I've also worked on a case here in Tennessee where we had Cypress esculentus, yellow nutsedge infestations identify a massive clog in a drain line. The problem would not go away. It was really centered along the drain line. Golf course superintendent here went in, investigated the problem with the drain line, and saw a blockage that was causing the soil to stay wet. Again, the weed was indicative of a problem. There's been several cases where we have greens that have issues with some of these indicator reads for excessive soil moisture, where we've seen them indicate problems with the root zone. We can see here an accumulation of organic matter at the top of this root zone, some layering, also maybe some black layer present within the soil profile. All of these things are reducing the competitiveness of the grass on this putting green and allowing the environment to be more favorable for weed infestation. So again, the big take-home message from today, and I'm going to continue to highlight this, is that when you see a weed in your turf, it should trigger you to think about the growing environment. Everybody wants to remove that weed from their turf, and I understand that, but thinking about the growing environment is going to hopefully make these problems be less problematic over time. Here are 4 different species, oxalis species, Polygonum aviculare, which many know as prostrate knotweed, euphorbia species, these are the spurges, very common in turf, Andropogon virginicus, this is broom sedge, which is increasingly problematic grassy weed of turfgrass systems here in the US. All of these are indicators of droughty soils, maybe areas where we have not enough soil moisture. There's a problem with irrigation now where we're not getting enough moisture to the turf. We're losing turf vigor, we're losing turf density, and we're seeing issues. And here's a full list of weeds that fall under this uh, distinction of being an indicator for drought stress. We've already talked about the first four. Goosegrass or Eleusine indica can be another weed where we see it be an indicator of maybe droughty conditions where turf can no longer be competitive. Lespedeza, and then our plantago species, particularly broadleaf plantain. These are all weeds that we tend to see be an indicator for drought stress and droughty soils where turf cannot be as vigorous as we would like. Here on the screen, we have a photo from a cart path at a golf course, a non-paved cart path. This is in Southeast Asia, and we can see a heavy infestation of goosegrass, of Eleusine indica, here on this cart path. And this is a very common weed in golf. Often here, this is a golf course in South Carolina. We can see a paved portion of the golf course cart path, and then where the golf carts themselves leave that paved portion onto the turf, we're losing turf density and vigor. We can see goosegrass problems regularly in these sorts of situations where we have high traffic. Goosegrass is probably our most well-known indicator weed, in that it is an indicator for compacted soils, a soil that has lost or has increased in bulk density such that turfgrass growth is now compromised. It can grow in that environment and thrive, where a different turfgrass species may struggle, and that's why we see goosegrass in those areas. Prostrate knotweed, Polygonum aviculare, and another species that is an indicator for compacted soils. Euphorbia and Poa annua can be indicators for compacted soils. And we have several others. We've talked about the first four. The Juncus species, the rushes, certainly can be an indicator for a potential soil compaction problem, as can Lespedeza and broadleaf plantain. Here's a photo from a sports turf situation, just to highlight what this looks like. So this is a soccer field from Pennsylvania, a Poa pratensis and Lolium peren soccer field. And in the middle of this soccer field, where we have the bulk of the traffic, we can see a very heavy infestation of Polygonum aviculare, prostrate knotweed. And when we get outside of that traffic area, our population has gone down. And this, again, is not coincidental. The soil in the areas that receive the most foot traffic is going to become compacted over time. That's very well known and very natural. And that is where we see this indicator weed, prostrate knotweed, persist. So the prostrate knotweed on this screen is telling us this area in the middle of the field, we have a soil compaction issue. When we get outside of the center of the field and more towards the sideline in the back of the photo, we have less prostrate knotweed, and that's an indicator that our soil there is a little bit healthier and more conducive for successful growth of Poa pratensis. Here's just another example of annual bluegrass or Poa annua surviving in a highly compacted state. This photo was taken in Chile, outside of Santiago. This is a parking lot at a hotel, a paver parking lot, so you can imagine the type of soil compaction with vehicles driving on this area with regularity. And our annual bluegrass or Poa annua is really thriving in this situation. And this is the first photo I showed you of Eleusine indica on a golf course cart path in Thailand. And the big take home here, and I would like for everybody to remember this, is that when you see this situation like we have on the screen, more than herbicides will be needed here. We are very fortunate in the United States that we have a lot of technology available for weed management, more so than other parts of the world. And far too often there's a reliance only on herbicide to try to solve our weed control problems. And that is not stewardly and really not good thinking for the long term. It has driven resistance issues in agronomic cropping systems. We now have resistance issues in turfgrass systems, where I work a lot on. The take home here is that if you see this sort of dynamic where we've got continual golf course traffic to the point that we have lost turfgrass density, we've lost turfgrass vigor, and we now have a problematic weed such as Eleusine indica really established in mass, we can't just spray that with a herbicide and think it's going to fix the problem. We need to remove those plants however possible and then change the growing environment to make reinfestation of those plants less likely over time. Here are 4 more weeds. Trifolium repens, white clover. I think many are familiar with Trifolium repens as a weed of turf. Veronica arvensis, this is a speedwell species. It's very common in dormant, warm season turfgrass stands. Medicago lupulina, black medic is what we call that weed here, common name-wise in the U.S. And then I've already showed you Andropogon virginicus. These are all indicators of soil with low nitrogen. They are species that, particularly Trifolium and Medicago, are species that are legumes, and legumes have the ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So they can persist in environments where applied nitrogen or available soil nitrogen, be it from fertilizer applications or mineralization of nitrogen from soil organic matter, they can persist in environments where those resources are limited because they have the ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And again, this is another indicator of a management problem. If you see a heavy infestation of Trifolium repens in your turf, that's an indicator that nitrogen fertility has declined to the point that now we've got a weed present that can survive and persist in this environment, and our turf is declining, that we haven't supplied sufficient nitrogen to foster turfgrass growth. Now we've got this weed here indicating that that's a problem for us. And we know when we look at the amount of a given nutrient within turfgrass clippings and the nutrients that drive growth. This is a slide from my friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Woods, with the Asian Turfgrass Center in Thailand. We know that nitrogen is really the driver, that this is going to be the nutrient that is found in the greatest quantity within tissues and is going to drive growth to the greatest degree. And there's been plenty of research to show that the overall health of a soil is not going to be a function of ratios of things such as calcium or magnesium or potassium, that we often worry in the turfgrass industry about these other nutrients and how they relate to each other on a ratio basis. And we have good data out there to show that that's really not the case. I would tell you that if you see these weeds that are indicators of low nitrogen, the first thing you should do is soil test, that there should be a flag that something in regards to my overall nutrient program is off. I should take a soil test and see what the results come back as describing my turfgrass area to be. And I think interpretation of those results is really critical. And the interpretation piece is really where things can go askew. There's a relatively new guideline that was developed by PACE Turfgrass, Dr. Larry Stoll and Wendy Glertner, as well as Dr. Michael Woods with the Asian Turfgrass Center, called the Minimum Level for Sustainable Nutrition. And what this is based on is a global soil survey where turfgrass managers from across the globe submitted samples from healthy turfgrass stands, and then they quantified the concentrations of each nutrient within those soils to try to develop guidelines for what would be the minimal level of a given nutrient that we would want to be at in order to have optimal turf growth. And you can see these nutrients here. And I'd encourage you to use these guidelines, these MLSN guidelines, in interpreting your soil test results, because we have information to show that over application of nutrients can certainly drive increases in weed pressure. And probably the most famous study illustrating that is conducted at Rothamsted, the Rothamsted Research Center, north of London in Harpenden, England. And this was it's still an active study. It's approaching 200 years old now. And what they have done in this situation is simply manage these plots that you see in the photo, this aerial photo, manage these plots under different nutrient regimes for hundreds of years, and then look at the species diversity within the plots as a function of that nutrient regime. So here is an example. These are mainly Festuca species in terms of the turf grasses present, but here is a plot that has only received nitrogen for over 150 years. It's received no phosphorus, no potassium, no calcium, and we can see here that we do not have a lot of weeds present within this stand. If we contrast this with a plot that's received nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, and magnesium annually for the duration of the cycle, we can see a much greater increase in weed pressure within this turfgrass stand. There are published reports of a 20% increase in dandelion, Taraxinum officinale incidence within these plots due to the inclusion of potassium fertilization alone. And I was lucky enough in 2015 to be able to visit these plots myself, and I took this photo that you see here, not nearly as striking as those that Micah provided earlier when weeds were in the fullest of bloom, but on the left side you can see again plots that have received only nitrogen fertilization compared to the right side plots that have received nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium every single year. Again, driving home this point about applying nutrients above the MLSN guidelines, potentially leading to an increased incidence of weed pressure in turfgrass. We also have data, this is from the International Turfgrass Research Society Journal in 2013 from Penn State University. Scientist there, Robert Rayleigh, did a very nice project looking at Poa annua infestation into a Agrostis stolonifera putting green. This was a new putting green that was devoid of annual bluegrass at the start at construction, and they looked at different phosphorus application regimes under different nitrogen application regimes, and what they saw was very striking, that increasing our phosphorus fertilization into this stand led to an increase in annual bluegrass incidence. And this was really true at every nitrogen regime that they tested. And if you'd like to find more about that study, the citation is below, and I would be happy to share the publication with anyone that's interested when the presentation is concluded. We have several other species that are going to be indicators of shade stress. So this on the top left, Glaucoma hederaceae or ground ivy, are viola species or violets in turfgrass. Both of these can be indicators of shade issues. Microstegium venenium and toxic, I'm going to have trouble with the pronunciation of this, Toxicodendron radicans are both species, again, that are going to be indicators of shade stress. And we have others as well that will be in turf grass, and you can see here in the photo, this is a Festuca arundinaceae tall fescue lawn in Tennessee, and we can see very heavy incidence, particularly of ground ivy, Glaucoma hederaceae, in this lawn situation. We can see tree canopy shade in the photo, so it's no surprise why the ground ivy is there. And again, we look at this turf and say, if I'm going to implement a technique to try to remove this ground ivy, that is wonderful, but if I don't do something to remove that shade, it's likely that that ground ivy is going to reinfest this turf over time. And I think that this is important on Bermuda grass surfaces, and particularly knowing the issues that Bermuda grass surfaces can have with shade and reduced growth and vigor under shaded situations. In the few minutes I have remaining, what I'd like to do is just walk through a short case of integrated weed management with Digitaria species, crabgrass as we refer to them common name-wise here in the U.S. The photo is Digitaria sanguinalis, or large crabgrass. And I was part of a research team with North Carolina State University and the University of Georgia, where we looked at pre-emergence herbicide efficacy as affected by turfgrass mowing height. And I know that this will be important to many of you, particularly those listening in Spain, given that pendimethalin has recently become a option for you to use for weed control on turf. And very simply, what we found, we looked at a number of different pre-emergence herbicides. Some of these you do not have available to you, but the take-home was very clear. On the y-axis, we have crabgrass control, and then on the x-axis, we have our different herbicide treatments. And the yellow bars are our mowing height. So we had a 1.5 centimeter mowing height, and then the green bar is the 5 centimeter cutting height. And really, regardless of the herbicide that we chose, we had greater smooth crabgrass control at my location in Knoxville, and this was true on large crabgrass in Georgia and on smooth crabgrass in North Carolina. We had greater smooth crabgrass control regardless of herbicide when the turf was managed at 5 centimeters as compared to 1.5 centimeters. Now, I am not advocating for you to be mowing fairways, for example, at a 5 centimeter cutting height. That's not the case at all. The take-home message here is that any increase that you can make in your mowing height is going to improve the performance of a pre-emergence herbicide. This is for several reasons that I don't have time to get into today. Number one is it's going to shade the soil surface to make less sunlight available for Digitaria germination. And overall, we know that any increase we can make in the mowing height of a turf grass is going to increase our overall photosynthesis and make our grass more competitive. Bell and Dannenberger published a report in 1999 that a 0.4 millimeter increase in mowing height will increase our photosynthesis by 13%. So you can imagine it doesn't take much of an adjustment in mowing height to improve our overall photosynthetic capacity and health of our turfgrass stand. So in summary, again, the take-homes here are that weeds can reveal problems with our growing environment, and the key to weed management moving forward is to make the environment more favorable for the turf and less favorable for the weed. And that is really critical for sustained weed management over time. That's all I have for technical content. I want to take a minute just to direct everybody to our website here at Tennessee, TennesseeTurfGrassWeeds.org, and you can see the link below. This is a resource that we use to share all of our weed control information. You'll find many things on here, particularly fact sheets. As you can see here, these are free fact sheets that you can download as a PDF file to provide information about different weeds of turfgrass and options for control. You will also have the ability to download a web-based mobile application that we've used for selecting herbicides for use in turfgrass and ornamentals. This will run on your desktop computer, it will run on a laptop, and it will run on any mobile device you choose to use, whether that be your phone or an iPad or a tablet, anything of that nature. I should thank the individuals on the screen. I'm very fortunate. I have two great research technicians, Greg Breeden, the gentleman with the mustache, and then Javier Vargas. They work for me and do a lot of hard work to generate the data that we use in our research. And then this gentleman below in the tie, a recent graduate student, Eric Razor, who just finished his PhD in our program. If you are on Twitter, I am very active on that platform. You can see my Twitter handle there at UTTurfWeeds, as well as my email address, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have after today on either of those platforms. And if we have a moment to do so now, I can take any questions that have come in since I've been speaking.
Hello, Jim. Thank you very much. A really great presentation. I've been enjoying a lot. So let me just say some words in Spanish, and I'm back to you.
Okay.
Thank you. Bueno, solo recordaros que ahora podéis ir pasando las preguntas o las dudas que tengáis. Y bueno, solo recordaros que bueno, que esta presentación se puede, bueno, es gracias a la colaboración de nuestros patrocinadores. Dejadme recordarlos como son Compo Expert, Syngenta, Semillas Fito, Jacobsen, Hunter, Wiedemann, y con la colaboración reciente también de Aquaid, Melspring, Servicentra y Herbatec. Nada, pues que sepáis que gracias a sus aportaciones pues podemos hacer estas presentaciones. Entonces lo que vamos a hacer es voy a parar otra vez en inglés para traspasarle alguna pregunta que hay. Hello Jim, let me ask you a question from Jorge Esteban. He says that he has some problems fighting Paspalum notatum on Bermuda grass. He's trying to do it with MSMA or with metsulfuron, and he is asking if he can do something else.
That's a very good question, and I'm sorry to hear about a struggle with Paspalum notatum on Bermuda grass. Those are two of the key herbicides, MSMA and metsulfuron, that are recommended. I would think that one avenue he could potentially make to his program would be to consider the time of year at which he's applying. I'm not sure what part of the world he's managing turf in, but for us here in the United States, when we focus on Paspalum control, particularly Paspalum delicatum control in Bermuda grass, we like to advocate for applications in the autumn of the year, as our warm season grasses tend to transition into the winter season and prepare for dormancy. We feel that the herbicides tend to perform better when applied at that timing because they will translocate to the perennial structures of the weed along with the photosynthate that's produced to prepare those grasses to survive winter.
Okay, great. Another question. Using phosphite well, against Mycodrochium valley, taking into account the relationship between the phosphorus fertilization promoting Po annua. Do you think there is that we are promoting Po annua with the use of phosphites?
With the use of phosphites, as in phosphite fungicide, I would say no. There has been a pretty good amount of research done here in the U.S. by several individuals looking at phosphites and their ability to act as a phosphorus type fertilizer. That is that area is outside of my expertise, obviously. However, my understanding of that research is that that is not the case, that they don't perform as a phosphorus application of fertilizer would. Therefore, I wouldn't think that that would be increasing in bluegrass incidence at all.
Okay, thank you. Another one. There is some kind of relationship between the iron levels in the topsoil with POA.
With,
So
with iron
yeah,
level,
yes. If there are high levels of POA affect of iron, sorry, affects POA and what?
I have not heard of high levels of iron increasing POA problems in turfgrass. If anything, I know that iron is often used in nutrient programs to try to discourage POA incidence. Um, just because I'm not aware of a relationship does not mean one doesn't exist. In my time, though, I've actually not come to become, I have not become familiar with seeing elevated iron be related to elevated annual bluegrass.
Sorry, there is one question, but I can quite understand. Well, I don't understand completely because he's asking about low rate of glyphosate to find. Sorry, let me ask. Sorry, it's because I don't understand the question.
I will say this, that low rates of glyphosate in general, I don't know the
Yes,
question.
yeah, yes. Use as an herbicide. Yes, using low
We
rate of glyphosate. Yes, yes. In late summer, mainly in late summer. He's asking.
Yeah, we as a general rule, low rate applications of any herbicide are really not recommended. We have pretty good data to illustrate that use of herbicides at lower than labeled rates really selects for more complicated resistance issues, particularly non-target site resistance issues. And these are really challenging, and we really don't, we want to do anything in our power to not get to a situation where we have non-target site resistance in any weed. And the data from agronomic crops are very clear that low rate applications tend to favor that development. So usually the recommendation has been to not use a low rate apps of a herbicide, but rather to use the product at the given label rate.
Okay, thank you. So there are no more questions, Jim. So that's all. Let me thank you again for your collaboration and your great presentation. So thank you. And for me, that's all. So I hope we can collaborate again in the near future.
Absolutely. I enjoyed it greatly, and I hope everybody listening has a great evening.
Okay, so thank you very much. Let me say goodbye to the attendees in Spanish and
Okay.
ok, thank you. Bueno, pues nada, pues si no tenéis nada más, dejadme comprobar un momento, pero no hay más preguntas, pues nada. Pues me despido ya de vosotros hasta el próximo webinar, que será el 11 de mayo. Contaremos con la colaboración de Alberto Sánchez de Tilum, que nos hará una presentación sobre el monitoreo de las propiedades físicas del suelo, los diferentes, digamos, devices, bueno, diferentes instrumentos que podemos utilizar para monitorear las propiedades físicas del suelo. Uh, pues por mi parte nada más. Muchas gracias a todos por vuestra presencia. Hay Jorge Esteban que ahora cuando me está pidiendo el correo, ahora te lo mando, no hay problema. Muchas gracias hasta todos y hasta la próxima. Adiós. Okay, Jim. So thank you and good day.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.